بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. ودع ابن حبان نقيض دعواه فقال إن رواية اثنين عن اثنين إلى أن ينتهي لا توجد أصلا. قلت إن أراد أن رواية اثنين فقط عن اثنين فقط لا يوجد أصلا فيمكن أن يسلم، وأما سورة العزيز التي حررناها فموجودة بألا يرويه أقل من اثنين عن أقل من اثنين. Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he now mentions about the view of Alama ibn Hibbān rahimahullah, and he claims that Alama ibn Hibbān rahimahullah, he held the opposite view of Alama ibn al-Arabi rahimahullah. So he says, وَدَّعَ ابْنُ حِبَّانَ نَقِيضَ دَعْوَاهُ, that Alama ibn Hibbān rahimahullah, he claimed the opposite of his claim, and that is the view of Alama ibn al-Arabi rahimahullah. فَقَالَ إِنَّ رِوَايَةَ اثْنَيْنِ عَنِ اثْنَيْنِ إِلَىٰ أَن يَنْتَهِيَ لَا تُوجَدْ أَصْلًا. He said that the transmission of two from two إِلَىٰ أَن يَنْتَهِيَ until the end, so that's the end of the sanad, such a narration cannot be found at all. From the way Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah opened the statement and how he phrased the beginning portion of the sentence, it might seem as if Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah was of the view that every narration in Sahih al-Bukhari is gharib. That every narration in Sahih al-Bukhari is such that at some point in the chain there is only one narrator, and this is called gharib. Inshallah, we'll do that ahead. Because Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah wrote, وَدَّعَ ابْنُ حِبَّانَ نَقِيضَ دَعْوَاهُ, that Ibn Hibbān, he claimed the opposite of what Alama ibn al-Arabi rahimahullah said. So if a person just reads this portion, وَدَّعَ ابْنُ حِبَّانَ نَقِيضَ دَعْوَاهُ, that Ibn Hibbān, he claimed the opposite of Alama ibn al-Arabi rahimahullah, then what would he think? He would assume that since Alama ibn al-Arabi rahimahullah, he said that every narration in Sahih al-Bukhari is Azīz, it has a minimum of two narrators. The opposite of that is that every narration in Sahih al-Bukhari is gharib, that it has at least one narrator, or it has only one narrator in a particular link of every chain. So this is the opposite of what Alama ibn al-Arabi rahimahullah mentioned, isn't it? Although Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah then explained what Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah mentioned, but definitely this is not the best way to phrase it, because before reading the explanation, a person will be a little bit confused. Nevertheless, in this paragraph, Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah is accusing Alama ibn Hibbān rahimahullah of claiming that there is absolutely no narration in which there are only two narrators in a particular link of the sanad. So this here is not the opposite of what Alama ibn al-Arabi rahimahullah mentioned. Rather, it is a completely different claim, unless we consider that he is referring to the implication and outcome of the statement of Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah. Like Alama Laqani rahimahullah, he explained, بِطَرِيقِ اللُّزُومِ لِأَنَّهُ إِذَا نَفَى وُجُودَ الْعَزِيزِ الْبَتَّةِ لَزِمَ أنه غير موجود في البخاري, that here it's maybe by means of implication, because if he is denying the existence of Azīz altogether, then it naturally follows that there can be no Azīz narration in Sahih al-Bukhari, isn't? Because if there is a narration in, that is Azīz in Sahih al-Bukhari, then you cannot deny all Azīz narrations. So Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah, Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah is claiming that Ibn Hibbān was of the view that there is no Azīz narration. Firstly, to explain who Alama ibn Hibbān rahimahullah was, Alama ibn Hibbān rahimahullah is Abu Hatim Muhammad ibn Hibbān ibn Ahmad al-Busti. He was born in the year 270 Hijri, and by now you know the importance of recording this, making a note of it, or if you want to highlight it in the footnotes. So remember, as this is using the print of Sheikh Nuruddin Itr. I'll explain now about Sheikh Rahili's print. So he was born in the year 270 Hijri, and he passed away in the year 354 Hijri. Now those of you who are using the print of Sheikh Rahili, if you look in your footnotes, you can see that he wrote that he was born in the year 260 Hijri, isn't it, on page 53. But saying that he was born in the year 260 Hijri, this is incorrect. Rather, he was born in the year 270 Hijri. In fact, Alama Dhahabi rahimahullah, he even takes it beyond 270 Hijri. He said, وَلِدَ سَنَةَ بِضْعِ وَسَبْعِينَ وَمِئَتَيْنِ. And here wanting to show you, for those of you who are interested in Aqidah, so if you have the same print as us, then you can check footnote number 4. So Shaykh Nuruddin Itrah, he narrates that Alama ibn Hibbān rahimahullah was expelled because he denied that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is confined to any place. So he writes, أنكر قول المشبهة بإثبات الحد لله تعالى فأخرجوه من بلده. That because he refuted and he spoke against those who are establishing a direction and a place for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the people expelled him from his locality. And فقال العلماء كان هؤلاء أولى بالإخراج. Obviously, because their view was incorrect, that they playing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a direction, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have a place. So therefore, they were more deserving to be expelled. And this shows that the view of the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not have any direction. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not restricted to place and time. So Alama Dhahabi rahimahullah, he quotes the full incident in Siyar A'lam al-Nubala in volume 16 on page 97. وقال أبو إسماعيل الأنصاري سمعت يحيى بن عمار الواعظة وقد سألته عن ابن حبان فقال نحن أخرجناه من سجستان. We are the ones who expelled him from Sijistan. كان له علم كثير. We do not deny that he was very knowledgeable. ولم يكن له كبير الدين. But he was not very religious. قدم علينا, he came to us, فأنكر الحد لله فأخرجناه. Then he denied that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a direction, so we expelled him. This is in Siyar A'lam al-Nubala in volume 16 on page 97. After quoting this, قلت إنكاركم أرضا, and then he says والقول في ذلك مما لم يأذن به الله ولا أتى نص بإثبات ذلك ولا بنفيه ومن حسن إسلام المرء تركه ما لا يعنيه وتعالى الله أن يحد أو يوصف إلا بما وصف به نفسه أو علمه. So he's mentioning that your denial is also an innovation, and to engage and discuss all of this here is not even permissible. It's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not even given us permission to delve into. And then he said, he quotes the narration min husn islam al-mar'i tarkuhu ma la ya'ni. So Alama Dhahabi rahmallah quotes all of this, and this here is an important statement, especially since Alama Dhahabi rahmallah is quoting it. Because when you study Aqidah, you will know how scholars differ and they disagree on books attributed to Alama Dhahabi rahimahullah. Some scholars claim that Alama Dhahabi rahimahullah, he actually wrote a book to establish and prove that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a direction. So this statement clarifies his view on this issue. Otherwise, he would have written a whole long comment here explaining that how this is incorrect and how Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah was deserving to be expelled. Nevertheless, in the text of Nuzha an-Naḍar, Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he claims that Alama ibn Hibbān rahimahullah, he was of the view there is absolutely no narration as Azīz that is in existence. But Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he first offers an explanation. He says, قلت إن أراد أن رواية اثنين فقط عن اثنين فقط لا يوجد أصلا فيمكن أن يسلم. That if he intends a narration of two, narrating from exactly two, and they are narrating from exactly two, then this year it's possible that we can accept it. So you understand what he's saying, that if Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah means a narration in which there are exactly two Sahaba from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then there are exactly two Tabi'in from the Sahaba, and then there are exactly two narrators in the very next link, then you remember we explained the scenario previously. So he says then it's this can be accepted, that it is indeed the case, there is no narration like this. So like I said, I explained this scenario a few lessons back. وأما سورة العزيز التي حررناها فموجودة بألا يروي وأقل من اثنين عن أقل من اثنين. He's saying, but as for how I explained Azīz, and we explained that his definition is not very accurate, but nevertheless saying what Ibn Hajar rahimahullah intended for Azīz, that there should be only two narrators in one particular link, and that should be the least amount of narrators in the sanad, then such a narration will be called Azīz. So he says that such a narration is and would there are such narrations. In order to determine what exactly Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah meant, we will have to revert back to his exact words. But before we do this, there are few important points to keep in mind. So firstly, we mentioned that Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah was born in the year 270 Hijri, and he passed away in 354 Hijri. And now, if you recall at the beginning of this chapter, when we were discussing the definition of Azīz, then we mentioned that Ibn Hajar rahimahullah is the one who is specifying Azīz to be a narration that it is which has only two narrators in a particular link. And I explained that before Ibn Hajar rahimahullah, scholars mentioned that Azīz is that where there are two or three narrators in a particular link. So therefore it is very unlikely for Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah, who passed away around 550 years before Ibn Hajar rahimahullah started to even write Nuzha an-Naḍar. It's very unlikely for him to be referring to the concept of Azīz as explained by Hafiz Ibn Hajar rahimahullah. Ibn Manda rahimahullah is perhaps the earliest known scholar to define the term Azīz. The scholars before him, they used the term, but they did not present an official definition. So Ibn Manda rahimahullah, he lived between the years 310 Hijri to 395 Hijri. So what does this mean? This means that Alama Ibn Manda rahimahullah, he was born when Alama Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah was already 40 years old. Now granted that Ibn Manda rahimahullah was 34 years old when Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah passed away, there are a few possibilities here. Firstly, either Ibn Manda rahimahullah already defined Azīz while he was still a youngster before the age of 34, or he did not as yet define the term Azīz. That's the first scenario. The second scenario is that if Ibn Manda rahimahullah did define the term Azīz, then either Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah came to know about it or not. In those times there was no internet, and it was not so easy for knowledge to be transferred to different parts of the world. So it's possible that Alama Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah did not come to know about it. But even if Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah did come to know about this definition of Azīz, then either he accepted it or maybe he did not accept it. And also keep in mind that Ibn Manda rahimahullah, he is regarding a narration that has two or three narrators to be Azīz. So Azīz was not specified to two narrators at that time. So I'm mentioning all of this because Hafiz Ibn Hajar rahimahullah brought the statement of Alama Ibn Hibbān under the chapter of Azīz. Otherwise you will see Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah, he does not even use the term Azīz, and therefore his statement does not have anything to even do with what Alama Ibn Hajar rahimahullah is discussing here about Azīz. But nevertheless, keep that point in mind. Another point to keep in mind before we refer to the text of Alama Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah is that when discussing the division of ahadith according to the muhaddithin, then we mentioned that there are two main categories, isn't mutawatir and ahad. And then there are three subcategories of ahad: mashhur, Azīz and gharib. So Azīz is part of ahad. And later in Nukhba, inshallah, those of you who are memorizing, and I trust all of you are memorizing, you know what, online lessons, they can't test you, but I trust you, inshallah, that you are memorizing, especially since we have these lessons only 2 days every week. So inshallah, you should try to memorize. But you will learn, وَكُلُّهَا سِوَى الْأَوَّلْ ahad, that each of them, apart from the first, are ahad. So Ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he explained these words then in Nuzha an-Naḍar, وَكُلُّهَا أَقْسَامُ الْأَرْبَعَةِ الْمَذْكُورَةِ سِوَى الْأَوَّلِ وَهُوَ الْمُتَوَاتِرُ ahad. What's ahad? That everything which is not mutawatir, that is ahad. وَيُقَالُ لِكُلِّ مِنْهَا خَبْرُ وَاحِدٍ. So keep this in mind, that what's khabrul wahid? It is that which is not mutawatir. Now we can go to the exact words. Look, what did Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah actually say? So in the introduction of his Sahih, he wrote, فَأَمَّا الْأَخْبَارُ فَإِنَّهَا كُلُّهَا أَخْبَارُ آحَادٍ. This is what he is mentioning, that all narrations are ahad reports. لأنه ليس يوجد عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم خبر من رواية عدلين روى أحدهما عن عدلين. Can you see that you have two narrators? From one of these you have two people narrating. وَكُلُّ وَاحِدٍ مِّنْهُمَا عَنْ عَدْلَيْنِ. And then from each of them you have two people narrating. So there already this here shows you how Ibn Hajar rahimahullah misquoted what he said. The way Ibn Hajar rahimahullah quoted it, it seems that in the riwayat اثنين عن اثنين إلى أن ينتهي, that it's two narrators from two narrators. It makes it seem as if there are two narrators in different links. But here you can already see عن كل وكل واحد منهما عن اثنين حتى ينتهي ذلك إلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. He's saying such narrations are not in existence. فلما استحال هذا وبطل ثبت أن الأخبار كلها أخبار الآحاد وأن من تنكب عن قبول إخبار الآحاد فقد عمل إلى ترك السنن كلها لعدم وجود السنن إلا من رواية الآحاد. So this here is the exact statement of Allama ibn Hibbān. It's on page 156 in volume 1. So after this lesson, inshallah, you should go back to this text, you should check it, scrutinize it, analyze it, and see whether Ibn Hajar rahimahullah understood his words correctly, or what the obvious meaning of what he is saying is. Because it's very clear that Allama ibn Hibbān rahimahullah, he is not even talking about Azīz, and he is denying the presence of a hadith that is transmitted in a pyramid fashion. You know, we spoke about this also previously, that he is referring to a narration which has two narrators in the first link. Alright, and then from each of them there are two narrators. So that means in the next link, how many narrators are there? 2 plus 2, there will be 4 narrators. Then from each of these 4 there are 2 narrators. So that means in the link below there will be 8 narrators. Then from each of these 8 there will be 2 narrators each. So that makes it in the next link there will be a total of 16 narrators. So in each link of the chain the amount is doubling. Can you see? Inshallah, if you want to, you can make your own table and you'll be able to understand it. So this is what Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah is mentioning. And therefore, when commenting on this text of Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, then Shaykh Muhammad Awama hafidhahullah, he mentions in his commentary of Tadrīb al-Rāwi, وتصرف الحافظ في حكايته بقوله إن أراد رواية اثنين عن اثنين، والصواب أن يقال إن أراد رواية اثنين وعن كل واحد منهما اثنين وعن كل واحد من هؤلاء الأربعة اثنان وهكذا. فهذه صورة خيالية يتم لابن حبان معها قوله استحال هذا وبطل. He's saying that the method that Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah related this by saying that if he intended that you have 2 narrators who are narrating from 2 narrators who are narrating from 2 narrators, this here is not precise. The accurate way is to say that if he intended a narration of 2, and then from each of these 2 you have 2 narrators, that means you only have 4, and then from each of these 4 you have two narrators, and so on and so on. This here is a hypothetical scenario. Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah, he completes it and he mentions that it's impossible to have a narration like this here. So this is the apparent meaning of the statement of Allama ibn Hibbān. If you read his words, this is mutabadir ila dhahn. However, Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda rahimahullah, he insisted that Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah is indeed denying the existence of Azīz. So he saw that his teacher Allama Kawthari rahimahullah, he gave the same interpretation to the words of Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah, like what Ibn Hajar rahimahullah gives here. So then Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda rahimahullah, he commented هذا تأويل بعيد جدا لكلام ابن حاتم بل المتعين من سياق كلامه أنه يريد نفي العزيز. He's saying that it's very clear that Ibn Hibbān is denying that you will have narrations that are Azīz. فإنه بصدد الاحتجاج لقبول أخبار الآحاد الغرائب والأفراد ولا يتم ذلك عند التأويل المذكور كما هو ظاهر. He's saying that look at the context. The context is that he's saying that he's basically speaking about whether you can accept akhbarul ahad. It means such narrations which has only one narrator in a particular link. So he's saying that now when you keep that context in mind, وَلَا يَتِمُّ ذَلِكَ عِنْدَ تَأْوِيلِ الْمَذْكُورِ. So that's what he wrote in his footnotes of Shurut al-A'imma al-Khamsa, which is printed with his Thalatha Rasail. It's on page 134. And then in his footnotes of Tawjih an-Naḍar on page 185, there he wrote, بل تحتمل عبارة نفي العزيز, that when Alama Tahir Jazairi is also mentioning something similar to what Ibn Hajar Rahmallah is mentioning here, and he says بل تحتمل عبارة نفي العزيز. However, as I said, that the very senior student of Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, Sheikh Muhammad Awama Hafidhahullah, he differed on how his closest teacher, because Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda was indeed his closest teacher, so he differed on how his closest teacher understood this. Ultimately, irrespective of which meaning a person takes or how he interprets the statement of Ibn Hibbān rahimahullah, the fact is وَأَمَّا سُورَةُ الْعَزِيزِ الَّتِي حَرَّرْنَاهَا فَمَوْجُودَةٌ بِأَلَّا يَرْوِيَهُ أَقَلْ مِنْ اثْنَيْنِ عَنْ أَقَلْ مِنْ اثْنَيْنِ. As for Aziz, as we have defined, so he mentions that it is present in Judah. It shows that there are just few examples. Otherwise, for mutawatir, he said for mawjuda wujuda kathra, isn't on page 45. So that shows that even though there may be Aziz narrations, but they are very few. And this is one of the reasons why it is called Aziz. Sheikh Ibrahim Lahim, he mentions on page 83 of his commentary, وَأَمَّا مُصْطَلَحُ عَزِيزٍ فَلَا يَكَادُ يُوجَدْ فِي كَلَامِهِمْ. That he say, as for the term Aziz, it is hardly found in their speech. And what is the reason that we learn terminologies? That we're learning, and now we're understanding what are all these terms that are being used. Why are we learning it? So there are two objectives. The first objective is to understand how the previous scholars use these terminologies. That if we have to open any book or we see that any scholar refer to a narration as Aziz, then we should know exactly what he is referring to. We should not go and then translate it with the literal meaning of Aziz and say that this here is a supreme narration. Rather, we should know it is actually a terminology. So that's the one reason why we study terminologies. And the second reason why we study terminologies is, inshallah, one day when we become great muhaddithin, if we need to comment on a narration, then we will know how to comment on that particular narration. If we find a narration with only two narrators in a particular link, then from our side we can also then refer to it by the official terminology, and we can consider that narration, and we can even call it a Aziz narration. But what Ibrahim Lahim is saying that you will hardly even find earlier scholars mentioning this term. Then now he's a great muhaddith, and he says قَدْ اجْتَهَدْتُ فِي الْبَحْثِ عَنْ اسْتِعْمَالِهِمْ لَهُ بِهَذَا الْمَعْنَى. He's saying that I spent a lot of time, I've endeavored in trying to find where the scholars did actually use it in this meaning, الَّذِي ذَكَرَهُ ابْنُ Manda. So whether you're taking it in the meaning of how Ibn Manda rahmallah mentioned it, or even in the meaning of how Ibn Hajar rahmallah mentioned it. وَهُوَ أَيُّرَادْ بِالْعِزَّةِ عَدَدٌ مُعَيَّنْ مِنَ الرِّوَاةِ إِثْنَانِ أَوْ ثَلَاثَةٍ. That's why I said, even if you consider it as Ibn Hajar rahmallah, يَرْوَوْنَهُ عَنْ رَاوٍ وَاحِدٍ مُعَيَّنْ فَلَمْ أَقِفْ عَلَى شَيْءٍ مِّن ذَلِكَ أَبَدًا. He's saying that I have not found any speech of theirs, I have not come across anything where the earlier scholars use the term Aziz. Yes, he says سِوَى كَلَامِ لِلْبَزَّارِ مُحْتَمَل. There are some ambiguous words of Alama Bazzar which could possibly have this meaning. So remember, Sheikh Ibrahim Lahim is a present day scholar, isn't he? Still alive. So he's mentioning this. Probably you can do your own research, and if you find that there were earlier scholars who used it, then you can then make note of it, and inshallah we can try to get it to Sheikh Ibrahim Lahim. He then quotes where Alama Bazzar rahimahullah, and also where Ibn Adi rahimahullah, Ibn Adi, where they use the term. But then he says, وَالَّذِي يَظْهَرُ أَنَّهُمَا لَمْ يُرِيدَا خُصُوصَ الْإِثْنَيْنِ وَإِنَّمَا أَرَادَا قِلَّةَ الطُّرُقِ. He's saying that what it appears that they did not intend to specify the amount to only two narrators. Rather, they intended that, one of the meanings of Aziz is that it's a very few. So they are trying to say that وَإِنَّمَا أَرَادَا قِلَّةَ الطُّرُقِ. So now you understand that this term has not been used very often by earlier scholars. Ibn Hajar rahimahullah himself, he also hardly ever used this term. وَابْنُ حَجَرْ نَفْسُهُ قليل الاستعمال له جدا. Sheikh Ibrahim Lahim says that Ibn Hajar rahimahullah himself, although he is presenting this definition here, but he himself hardly ever uses this term. Moving on, Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah now presents an example of Azīz. So he says, مثاله ما رواه الشيخان من حديث أنس. So now keep this in mind, that Shaykhan, Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim rahimahullah is narrated it from Anas. وَالْبُخَارِيُّ مِنْ حَدِيثِ أَبِي هُرَيْرَةَ أَنَّ رَسُولَ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ قال. So you may have noticed that Ibn Hajar rahimahullah, before that, another point, that here you can see is giving a definition, or rather is giving an example of an Azīz narration. But for Mutawatir, did he give any examples? So he went on and on, he spoke in so much detail, he went in circles, and he even mentioned that some people deny the existence of Tawatur, yet he did not provide any example. Likewise for Mashhur, he didn't give any example. I had to give them example. But here for Azīz and Gharib, he gives examples. So probably the reason why he now suddenly gives the example is because, remember, Hafiz ibn Hajar is the first to specify that Azīz must have two narrators. And scholars before him, they said that a narration could be considered and graded as Azīz if there are 2 or 3 narrators. But Ibn Hajar is specifying it to 2. So when you are specifying it to 2, then like we're saying that there's hardly any such narrations which could be found. And then you also got the statement of Ibn Hibbān, which could, scholars could understand it to mean that there is no Azīz narration. So therefore Ibn Hajar rahimahullah, if he's going to present the definition, it's now to defend himself, I'm telling you that I'm suggesting this definition to you, but you could turn around and say there's no such narration like this here. So it would mean that this definition of Hafiz ibn Hajar is redundant. Therefore, Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah wants to prove that there are examples like this, and he furnished an example for this reason. So to avoid being refuted, he gives an example for Azīz in order to prove the existence of Azīz narrations. So he says, مثال ما رواه الشيخان. This is what I was speaking about, that Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim narrates it from Anas radiyallahu an. And then he says, وَالْبُخَارِيُّ مِنْ حَدِيثِ أَبِي هُرَيْرَةَ. And only Imam Bukhari narrates it from Abu Hurairah. So he made the extra effort of mentioning وَالْبُخَارِيُّ مِنْ حَدِيثِ Abu Hurairah. Now looking at this way that Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah presented this example, because he's mentioning that first Anas radiyallahu anhu mentioned it. So he's quoting from Bukhari and Muslim that Anas radiyallahu anhu quoted this narration. And then he says that Imam Bukhari narrated it from Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu. He's highlighting that there were 2 Sahaba. And there were 2 narrators in the link of the Sahaba. There were 2 companions. And thereafter he shows how there were 2 narrators in every link from one of these 2 Sahaba. But you can see that he did make a point of saying that it's also narrated from Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu. So this led scholars to question whether it is conditional and whether it is essential that there must be 2 narrators in the era of the Sahaba, then only the narration will be Azīz, or whether it is fine if there is only 1 Sahabi. Because you remember for Tawatur, we quoted that Mullah Yunus Jaunpuri rahimahullah, he said that it's definitely a condition that there has to be multiple companions. That was with regards to Mutawatir. But then for Mashhur, what did we say? We quoted that it's not necessary that there has to be multiple companions. So with regards to Azīz, Allama Qasim ibn Qutlubagha rahimahullah, he took note that Ibn Hajar rahimahullah is clearly mentioning the names of 2 companions. So therefore he felt that there has to be a reason why Ibn Hajar rahimahullah is mentioning the names of 2 companions. Because now he's only going to show how 2 narrators narrated it from Anas radiyallahu an. So after mentioning about Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu here, he's not discussing anything further about him. He's not going to show you the narrators from Abu Hurairah radiyallahu an. So the reason why he clearly highlighted that Abu Hurairah radiyallahu an also narrated it is to make a point to show you that there are 2 narrators in the era of the Sahaba. So because of this, Allama Qasim ibn Qutlubagha, he assumed that it is necessary that there must be two narrators in the era of the Sahaba, Azīz wal-Mashhur, حيث قالوا إن العزيز لا بد فيه ألا ينقص عن اثنين من الأول إلى الآخر فإن إطلاقه تناول ذلك. Other scholars, they also then accepted that consideration has to be taken for the amount of narrators in the era of the Sahaba. So those of you who studied Bayquniya, and if you read the commentary Al-Jawahir al-Sulaymaniya, then you remember Sheikh Mustafa ibn Ismail, he said, وَالَّذِي يَظْهَرُ لِي اشْتِرَاطُ الْإِثْنَيْنِيَّ فِي طَبَقَةِ الصَّحَابَةِ أيضا في الحديث العزيز. And what appears to me that it's necessary that there should be two narrators in the era of the Sahaba for a narration to be considered as Aziz. Because you see, Ibn Hajar made it a point to indicate to the narration of Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu. And besides this, just to give you an example from another narration. So if you look at the comments of Alama Ala'i rahimahullah on another narration, the hadith نحن الآخرون السابقون يوم القيامة. So in Tadrib al-Rawi, Alama Suyuti rahimahullah, he quotes Hafiz Ala'i rahimahullah is mentioning Al-Hadithu Azizun ani Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. That this hadith is Aziz from the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Why it is Aziz from the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam? Rawahu anhu Hudhayfah ibn al-Yaman wa Abu Hurairah. So he made it again a point to show that there are two companions, and this is now becomes more clearer because then he says وَهُوَ مَشْهُورٌ عِنْدَ أَبِي هُرَيْرَةَ. Now I showed you that there are two narrators in this one link, but now from Abu Hurairah it is mashhur, that there are more than three narrators who are quoting it from Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu, because, and then he quotes how seven narrators quoted it from Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu. So he's claiming that it is an Aziz narration from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Why? Because two companions narrated it. And then he says it's mashhur from Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu because seven narrators related it from him. And this he also shows us that a narration can be termed differently depending which angle you, if you look at the narration, you can then use different terms for the exact same narration. But in contrast to these scholars who claim that there has to be two companions, Alama Jazairi rahimahullah, he says, وَالْمَشْهُورُ عِنْدَ الْمُحَدِّثِينَ أَنَّهُمْ لَمْ يَشْتَرِطُوا فِي الْمَشْهُورِ فَضْلًا عَنِ الْعَزِيزِ التَّعَدُّدْ فِي الصَّحَابَةِ. That they do not, the muhaddithin, they do not stipulate that there must be many Sahaba for a mashhur narration, leave alone Aziz. So this here you can see there are differences of opinion. There are very few narrations, but from those few narrations, if you go and inspect it and look at it, then you can then do an in-depth research, because there are so few. So you'll have to do a really a great research and find all the narrations that are Aziz, and then you can inspect whether there are multiple Sahaba or not, and that's how you will come to the preferred view. As for your own usage, you can prefer one of these two views, that maybe one day when you become a great muhaddith and you find that there's only one Sahabi narrating it, then if you want to, you can say that, okay, we're not going to consider this to be an Aziz narration, we're going to consider it as a Gharib narration, because there is only one narrator in the era of the Sahaba. Now, with regards to the text of the narration, there is no need to go into the details, because here our objective is not to explain the mutun of the Ḥadīth, rather it is to recognize how this narration is Aziz. But we will just suffice with the explanation of Mullah Ali Qari rahimahullah. So he says that the statement لا يؤمن أحدكم أي حقيقة الإيمان, that none of you has a حقيقة الإيمان أو كماله حتى أكون أحب إليه من والده وولده, أي حبا اختيارا مستندا إلى الإيمان الحاصل من الاعتقاد لا حبا طبعيا. That a person must voluntarily love the Prophet ﷺ because of his conviction and because of his iman on the Prophet ﷺ. It's not, obviously, it does not refer to natural love. لأن حب الإنسان نفسه ووالده وولده مركوز في الطبع خارج عن حد الاستطاعة. It's not possible for a person to have the طبعي love, the love which he has for himself. It's firmly from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. والمعنى لا يصدق به حتى يفدي في طاعتي نفسه, that a person, he does not believe in me until he is willing to sacrifice himself in my obedience. ويؤثر على هواه رضائه, and over his own wants, his own desires, he prefers pleasing me. وَإِن كَانَ فِيهِ هَلَاكُ, even if it may seem that he has to go through inconvenience, or even if he has to go through extreme difficulty. The word halak means destruction. So even if it means destroying his own self, if he has to even if he has to cause difficulty to himself, he will still give preference to that which pleases me. Then here also you can see that the word al-Ḥadīth is used. So generally, when scholars would quote a portion of a narration, then they would just mention al-Ḥadīth. So that means that it refers that the entire narration has not been quoted. Rather, there is still the narration continues. So therefore, the word al-Ḥadīth is written. It means that there is more to the narration. Now what Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah said. So remember, he quoted from Abu Hurairah radiyallahu an, but now he's only focusing on the sanad which links to Anas radiyallahu an. So if you want to, you can write it down, then it will make it easier for you to understand. So you put the name Anas radiyallahu an, then from him, وَرَوَاهُ عَنْ أَنَس قَتَادَ وَعَبْدُ الْعَزِيزِ بْنُ صُهَيْبٍ وَرَوَاهُ عَنْ قَتَادَ شُعْبَةَ وَسَعِيدٍ وَرَوَاهُ عَنْ عَبْدِ الْعَزِيزِ إسماعيل بْنُ عُلَيَّ وَعَبْدُ الْوَارِثِ وَرَوَاهُ عَنْ كُلٍّ جَمَاعَةٍ. So he's saying that from Anas you have two narrators, Qatada and Abdul Aziz ibn Suhaib. And then from Qatada you have two narrators, and that is, you have Shu'bah and you have Sa'id. Now with regards to Sa'id, Allama Sakhawi rahimahullah, he mentioned in his commentary of the Alfiyah, وَالسَّعِيدُ عَلَى مَا يُحَرَّرُ. He's saying that, okay, the name Sa'id is written here and therefore I'll accept it. فَإِنِّي قَلَّدْتُ شَيْخَنَا. He says that, yeah, I'm just blindly following my teacher. I'm not really convinced that Sa'id actually did narrate this narration, but because my Shaykh mentioned it and I trust my Shaykh and I hold him in so much esteem, therefore I would say, okay, that also Sa'id narrated it. مع عدم وقوف عليه بعد البحث. Now you know Al-Masakhawi was such a great muhaddith, and he's saying that after much research I was unable to locate the narration where Sa'id is quoting Sa'id is quoting it from Qatada, from Anas, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى أكون أحب إليه من والده وولده. So you understand what's happening, that Al-Masakhawi rahimahullah is mentioning that he did not find a sanad from Sa'id, but his teacher Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah mentioned it, and therefore he is just following his teacher. So yeah, it was good that Allama Sakhawi rahimahullah followed his teacher Ibn Hajar rahimahullah, because this narration is narrated by Allama Isfahani rahimahullah in At-Targhib wa Tarhib. So he quoted, it's the 73rd narration. Nevertheless, the second student of Anas radiallahu anhu, Abdul Aziz ibn Suhaib, he also had two students. So one is Abdul Warith and the second is Ismail ibn Ulayya. And then from them a great number narrated it. So you can see the reason why this here is Aziz is because in the beginning links there were only two narrators. After that there are many narrators. That's fine. So we're not taking that into consideration. Now here you see that Hafiz ibn Hajar rahmallah, he did not mention the chain to Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu. And he ought to have mentioned it. And therefore, Ulama Najm al-Ghaythi, he said, أنه كان ينبغي أن يأتي بروايتهما أبي هريرة وأنس. That it would have been better, or rather he's saying that ينبغي, that he should have actually brought both of the asanid. How he brought the asanid and showing it from Abu Hurairah radiyallahu an, from Anas radiyallahu an, he should have also brought the asanid to Abu Hurairah radiyallahu an. So with regards to the sanad to Abu Hurairah radiyallahu an, Imam Bukhari rahimahullah narrates it. قال البخاري حدثنا أبو اليمان قال أخبرنا شعيب قال حدثنا أبو الزناد عن الأعرج عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنهم أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال فوالذي نفسي بيده لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى أكون أحب إليه من والده وولده. So here you can see that the student of Abu Hurairah is who? Is A'raj. A'raj is the one narrating from Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu. So he is the tabi'i